I'm just looking at this this lecture about torture, and one of the slides that I missed talking about is a very famous slide, probably one of the most famous images, and so I'm taking just a minute here to talk about it. It's called the Vietnam, and it shows a man who is hooded standing on a on a box, and he has two wires that are hooked up to his thumbs, and one that's around his penis. And the way that this works, this particular torture works, is that you stand this person on a box, anybody, and you put wires around their thumbs, and you attach the wires to, in this case, they attach them to radiators, is my memory of it, and pipes. And basically you say, if you fall, you'll cut your thumbs off and your penis. So good luck with that, So basically the person's standing there. And when this particular image was seen, excuse me, when this particular image was seen in the United States, experienced interrogators, and now we are talking about torturers, said, "Oh, I recognize that." Now somebody had to be trained to do that, and so it was the beginning of the explosion, if you will, or the uncovering of the fact that this was a practice, it was a policy, that and what these people said, they said that's called the Vietnam, and it's called the Vietnam because that's when it was used, and you had to be trained into how to do it. In other words, people don't just come up with that stuff on their own. Like, you sort of reinvent the wheel up to a point, but this is such a specific thing, hooding the person, putting them on this box. The whole thing it basically is a perfect panoptic punishment because you don't have to do anything. The person is entirely responsible for their own safety, and they are going to lose. All you have to do is wait for them to get tired. Nobody can stand there forever. In fact, nobody can stand there for very long at all. There's some incentive in this case if you want to keep your body parts. Okay, so I just want to put this in because this needs to be talked about. It's worth remembering as we talk about these. Now, these pictures that I've shown you are some of the grimmest pictures. These are only some. There are basically what was released to the public because there was such an outcry was about maybe 24 pictures of these scenes from Guantanamo. Now, this is beautifully covered in a film by Errol Morris, who was a very important filmmaker, one of the most important filmmakers of the late 20th, early 21st century, who made a film about Rumsfeld, made a film about McNamara, and he made a film about Abu Ghraib and the prison scandal at Abu Ghraib. And that film is called Standard Operating Procedure. And it comes to focus on Lindy England, because there were these two, Megan Amble and Lindy England, who were the two women who basically became the focus of, it's like, aha, see, this is why we didn't want to let women go to war. See how bad they are? And it's like, okay, whatever. It's just another dodge. England is the one who's shown, making finger guns at the guy who's masturbating. And Amble is the one who's, she always gives a big smile, she's this nice person, from rural America somewhere, I can't remember where, somewhere in the South, I think, and she's like, hey, hi, how's it going, and then there's this pile of bodies. They're alive, but it's like, Jesus. It's worth remembering that the IDF, that is the Israeli Defense Force, which I've talked about before, has given up on these techniques because basically it's learned that physical torture does not produce reliable intelligence or even information, because for something to become intelligence, it has to be information first. First you get information, then you look at it and you're like, yeah, there's actually intelligence here. If we put this information together in the right way, it looks like it's actually telling us a story that we can make use of. There's no point, in other words, the IDF decided, to these things except to harm people. You don't do this because you're trying to get actionable battlefield intelligence. As well, remember that in the field, we've got footage of soldiers, say, urinating on the dead, on dead bodies and so on. And again, these are not isolated incidents. Like the claim about My Lai, what people said about My Lai was that was a one-off. It's just this particular guy, Lieutenant Kelly, went nuts, and it was just this one time. It's like, no, actually, that's not the way it works. So the assassinations by the Americal Division were actually part of a much bigger picture of assassinations that were going on all the time across the country by all different sorts of units. These were carried out not just by interrogators, but also by what were called behavioral science combat teams. So here's another example of basically, as I say, social science at war. And these behavioral science combat teams, this is a bit of a mouthful, and so it's reduced to BSCTs, pardon me, and that is hard to say, so they're called Biscuits teams, which is a lot easier to say. And the Biscuits were not making things up as they went along. They were given a playbook by the CIA and its long practice of torture, which the agency always swears it never uses. The agency's like, no, we don't use torture. This is why I have such a problem with Zero Dark 30, because at the beginning of the film, you see them torturing, they get actionable intelligence out of the torture, and then they go and get bad guys. It's like, no, that's a lie. And Catherine Bigelow, you should know better. Because that and shows like 24 with Kiefer Sutherland, he should have known better. He's a bloody He's a bloody Canadian. I was going to say he's an American. He probably is an American. But he's the son of Donald Sutherland, who... it's just very aggravating. So, I mean, it is a crime, literally. If you're making a show like 24, what are you doing? Every time, in just about every show, as far as I recall, Kiefer Sutherland, takes like the paddles and he, shocks a guy, and the guy goes, the bomb is underneath the chair. It's like, okay, that's it. And it's like, the torture works every time. So people were like, well, why aren't we doing that? I mean, why don't we, I see it in 24. Every night I see it. And 24 was hugely popular during the early part of the Gulf War. So, very well, you and I know very well, that media has an enormous impact on people and the way that they understand the world around them and their quote-unquote reality, whatever their version of reality is. Well, 24 had an enormous effect on it, and so did Zero Dark 30. So the agency, the CIA, says, oh, no, we don't torture. The military and civilian intelligence agencies say, no, but they all want more information and they want to use harsher techniques, and they kept on pushing for this. So they had crucial advice not only for members of, but the top membership of the American Psychological Association. So where do you go if you want to know how to torture somebody? Well, go to a bunch of psychologists, because if somebody knows their way into your brain and knows how to push, on the buttons and make you scream in basically emotional agony, it's psychologists or psychiatrists, right? I mean, they're like, okay. So remember, the APA, which I talked about a few minutes ago, has the same kind of ethics statement as the American Anthropological Association or the doctors, right? Because in fact, the APA, they are doctors. They're doctors. They have research degrees. They're doctors of clinical psychology. They're not medical doctors. They're not MDs. A psychiatrist has to have an MD and then becomes a psychiatrist, a doctor of psychiatry. The APA denied that it had ever helped the CIA with torture, but an New York Times journalist, James Risen, in his book Pay Any Price, which I'll put up here, printed emails between the CIA and the leadership of the APA, not just individual doctors working on their own. So it is not as though you've got some bad actor, which is what you want to do. You want to say, well, it's just Lieutenant Kelly, or in this case, well, it was just Dr. Joe, blah blah blah, who did a bad job. It's like, no. This is the whole association that the CIA was talking to. What the CIA wanted and got from the American Psychological Association was language it could use to evade and explain away what it was doing, including the things I've just shown you as torture. It's now accepted that these things did constitute torture. Well, accepted by whom? I mean, I have to, especially as we get into this, the problem when Trump, one of the problems, one of the hundreds of thousands of problems when Trump came in was he was like, torture? Yeah, why not? Makes sense to me. And this is what Dick Cheney said when he was interviewed at one point when the torture stuff came out and they had to send out Dick Cheney to do damage control. And he said, seems like a slam dunk to me. You know, if I can torture Mullah Omar and he tells me where Osama is, why wouldn't I do that? And America was like, yeah, that makes sense. So you can look at the APA's own study, which is called All the President's Psychologists. This is online. I'll check and make sure it still is. That details the years during which the APA helped and covered up helping, that is, lied to the public, the CIA. Right? So they helped the CIA and they covered up that they helped. Why would you cover something up? It's like you cover something up because you know it's wrong. Remember that psychologists are doctors too and are bound by the same code of ethics that binds medical doctors and personnel, including nurses, anesthesiologists, well, they're doctors, anybody who's in the helping professions. What that means is that the Bush administration embraced and deliberately sought out techniques with which to torture human beings that held not only in places we know about, like Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, so Cuba, and also Abu Ghraib, the hard site in Iraq, as well as dozens of other prisons around Iraq, but also in the black sites, which I talked about, that were, until Snowden and Assange reigned on that particular parade, in friendly European countries, which included the Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Ukraine, and half a dozen others, as well as these prison ships, which I talked about, a true and utter nightmare. Let me add this, but before we think Canada is clean, Canadian soldiers followed Canadian government policy, which was given by Stephen Harper, which was to take high-value prisoners in Afghanistan and keep them? No. Turn them over to the United States. So that means that every time we took somebody in Afghanistan, Canadian soldiers took somebody in Afghanistan, we didn't keep them. We handed them to the United States, which we knew was torturing. Okay, so go ahead and tell me that Canada is clean. Now, I've had this discussion with a pile of people who I went to give a talk, I don't know, some time ago, about propaganda, and people they came up and they wanted to chat about the war. They didn't really want to chat with me. They didn't like they didn't like what I was saying. They didn't like the fact that I was saying, this isn't a good idea, blah, 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 what I normally would say. And I said, okay, well, how about this? They were like, well, anyway, that's the Americans. I'm like, oh, no. Canadians are handing over people, and we know we're handing them into a torture system. And they were like, well, we're not doing that. I'm like, we are. Don't go ahead, show me where there are Canadian prisons, actual prisons, because we're taking prisoners of war, in Afghanistan or at home. Where have we brought back Canadian prisoners of war? And they're like, well, I don't have that to hand. It's like, that's because there aren't any. Because I know this territory, and I'm telling you there aren't any. So if we're handing people over to the United States, guess what the United States is going to do with them? Torture them if they think they're high value. And they're like, well, look, that's a big, you're just getting caught up on details. And they didn't want to talk. This is the easiest way to get rid of people who are the war in Afghanistan. Like, well, let's talk about the soldiers that are the prisoners of war that we're taking, that aren't prisoners of war, apparently. Okay. And so I had these groups. This particular one of these groups had senior academics in it, and one of them said to me that this wasn't our business. They were like, well, that's not our business, what the Americans do with the people we hand over. And one of them literally made a hand-washing gesture. He was like, it's not our problem. And this is precisely how atrocity and war crimes happen. We find ways to excuse ourselves and to reject responsibility. And then we say, oh, well, we didn't do that. It's like, yes, we did.